Welcome to your video lecture on Chapter 9, Part 2, which is Soil Degradation and Soil Conservation. You can see on pages 233 through 234 and 242 through 250 of your book. Please be aware I'm going to be referring to your book a couple of times, so it may be in your best interest to make sure you've got it, and to make notes to yourself, put a piece of paper or a sticky note on the pages that I tell you probably need to take a look at. Alright, first we're going to start with your central case, which is about farming in southern Brazil. What were the farmlands of southern Brazil originally like? They were full of rich soil that made for bountiful harvests. What were three effects of farming on the area? The first one is that after time, it diminished the harvest. That means that in the same amount of area, you were getting less food per unit area. It also led to eroded topsoil. Topsoil, remember, is soil horizon A. It is the layer that has all of the nutrition in it, and repeated farming, for reasons we're going to talk about in a little bit, led to that being blown or washed away. And then the third thing is that waterways were fouled by synthetic fertilizer and topsoil. So when something washes away in one area, it has to end up somewhere else. So the topsoil and the fertilizer that were washed or blown away from the farmlands ended up in waterways. It either could be fresh water, which meant that you couldn't drink the water anymore, or it could be marine ecosystems where it influenced the biodiversity there. It could have killed off a variety of marine life. How can tilling the soil lead to soil erosion? To till the soil, and I'm going to show you some videos in class, to till the soil is what you're looking at right here. You either manually do it as a person with a hoe, or you do it with something called a plow. That's what this thing is down here, and it's being pulled by a horse. It's basically where you put a blade into the soil and you turn it over. Part of the reason that you do that is to get rid of weeds by basically covering them up with dirt. It also aerates the soil. Plants like to grow in soil that has air pockets in it. It's a lot easier for it to put its roots down. So you're basically getting the soil ready for growth. The problem, of course, is when you do this, you've got a bunch of bare earth that's just sitting there, and every time the wind blows or it rains, that topsoil can get washed away. So bare soil leaves topsoil vulnerable to erosion from wind and water. Describe how farmers reinvigorated the fertility of the soil. They went from conventional plowing practices, which is what you see right here, to something called no-till farming, which we're going to discuss in a few minutes. They also left what are called crop residues behind. So if you're growing corn and you just harvest the corn ears off of there, you're left with the stalk. So instead of pulling that up and then starting from scratch, you simply let it die back, and as it decomposes, that returns nutrition back to the soil. And then also the farmers planted cover crops. We'll talk about those again in a minute, but a cover crop is something that you grow that you have no intention of harvesting, and when it gets to a certain level of maturity, but before it produces seeds, you go ahead and plow that back into the soil, so again, you return nutrients back to the soil. List two ways to cover soil when commercial crops are not in the ground. Number one, you can leave crop residue on the field after harvesting, and number two, you can plant cover crops to keep the soil protected during periods when no commercial crop is being grown. Number three, besides providing nutrients to plants, what other benefit does organic matter in soil provide? Name one environmental and one economic benefit. The environmental benefit is that organic matter in the soil holds on to water. It's kind of absorbent like a sponge, which in turn not only does it encourage better crop growth so that your profits are better, it also means you have to water less, so you're saving money, so you increase your profits. Number four, how is no-till farming different from traditional planting? So instead of fully turning over the soil, leaving it bare as is done in traditional planting, which you can see here on this previous, on this slide right here, my apologies, you can see this is one called a furrow that's being plowed. You can imagine what this whole field would look like once it is full of furrows. This is also tilling the soil. You can see basically bare earth. Now, this is being tilled right before farming, so this is a little bit better. You can see that there are crop residues on the ground that are being plowed back into the soil, so that's better than nothing. Here, again, this is a cover crop, and soil residues. I'm trying to see if I've got a picture of no-till farming. Here we go. Instead of regular farming, which is here on the left, no-till farming is here on the right. You don't even bother to plow stuff in. You have these bins are called hoppers. They're full of seeds. And what's difficult for you to see right here is they drill the seeds directly into the soil. What normally happens is you till the farm like this, or you plow individual furrows into the soil. You then put seeds into the little lines in the ground, and then you come back and cover them up. Here, you're just drilling them directly into the soil. So the upside is you're not ever exposing the soil to soil erosion. One of the downsides, and there always is a downside, is that number one, you're still using, in this case, fossil fuel driven farming equipment, and when we talk about air pollution later on, you can see why that's a problem. It also, you're kind of compacting the soil. You're not giving it any opportunity to be turned over. Now, a good compromise here would be if you tilled in a traditional manner and then went back and covered it up with crop residues that weren't directly rooted into the ground, and then planted a quick growing cover crop where those roots and the plants themselves would keep the soil in place, so that when wind and water came through, the soil would stay where it was. Alright, let's see, How is no-till farming different from traditional planting? Instead of fully turning over the soil, leaving it bare, as is done in traditional planting, farmers practicing no-till farming cut a thin, shallow groove into the soil, drop in the seeds, and then immediately recover the seed with the soil and plant residue. So you're basically kind of unzipping the soil a little bit, putting seeds in and re-zipping it up. Alright, why is erosion a problem for ecosystems and agriculture? Nutrient-rich soil is lost to wind and water faster than it can be replenished, so you're essentially creating a desert or a desert-like area where you can no longer grow crops, and then you have to spend money and time creating synthetic fertilizer that you then put down, and in the meantime, everything that's gotten blown away ends up in a water source where it makes it either undrinkable or, if you're a marine life, unlivable. List 3 widespread practices that lead to soil erosion. Over-cultivating fields through poor planning and excessive tilling. You basically, if you over-cultivate fields, it means that you're taking nutrients away faster than can be put back through other means. So again, you're creating a desert area where plants can't grow at all, and then you're kind of setting them up for wind and water to blow away any nutritious soil that's left. Overgrazing rangelands with more livestock than the land can support. When something is overgrazed, the grass is eaten to the point that the plant dies, as opposed to if grass is eaten, it's kind of like mowing your lawn, it grows back because the roots are still alive. When something is overgrazed, which generally happens when you have more livestock than the land can support, it means that they're eating the roots as well. No plants in the ground, soil and washes or is blown away, leads to a desert-like area where nothing can then grow. Hopefully you're kind of getting a trend here. And then the same thing can happen when you do what's called clear cut of forest, which is where you basically cut everything down, no roots in the ground, topsoil washes away, nothing can grow again. Alright, and then also on steep slopes, when you cut a forest away at a steep slope, gravity basically washes away any topsoil before you can grow anything that will keep the soil in place. Alright, explain how plants and the roots protect plants from soil erosion. And that shouldn't say protect plants, that should say protect the ground from soil erosion. Vegetation breaks the wind, and vegetation also slows water flow because A, they're there, and then B, the plants take up water, and then roots hold the soil in place and again take up the water. So please recognize that it's not just the roots that are holding it in place, it is the action of the plant taking in water, and then also the vegetation itself keeps the wind from whipping across the soil. Alright. Alright. Explain the 4 principal kinds of water erosion and rank them by ability to move topsoil. So these are in your textbook. So if this is going too fast, you can either replay it again, or you can look in your textbook where there are pretty pictures. I'm going to show you some again. I'm going to show you some here in a second. Alright. Something called rill erosion, R-I-L-L, is where water runs along small furrows, deepening and widening into channels called rills. That has the greatest potential to move topsoil. The second greatest problematic type of erosion is called sheet erosion. That's where water flows in thin sheets over broad surfaces, washing topsoil away in uniform layers. The third most devastating erosion is called splash erosion. That's where raindrops dislodge soil particles that fill in gaps between remaining clumps. It decreases the soil's ability to absorb water. The least impactful type of erosion to topsoil is gully erosion. Now that's going to look to be the most dramatic, but the issue is these deep cuts in the soil, usually the result of merging rills, don't affect topsoil because at that point the topsoil is usually already gone. How does this happen? It's usually human means. On an FRQ, be able to explain exactly how things like overgrazing lead to soil erosion. Also, pre-existing environmental conditions don't help. Steep slopes, intense rain, sparse vegetation. So if you've got a ecosystem that is already very fragile with respect to soil erosion, and then people come in and kind of take away the very few supports that are there to keep the soil in place, you're going to end up with a desert. This is an example of gully erosion. You can see that this fence used to be straight, and this guy is down here going, oh my god, what happened? You can see part of the issue here is, number one, the brush that's here is not what you would call very robust, and then number two, this is gravity kind of did its thing when there were no plants in the ground to start with. Here you can see rill and sheet erosion, and when soil and fertilizer ends up in the water, we have eutrophication. That's in both marine and freshwater ecosystems. Here's a severe gully erosion in Bolivia. To scale, these are average-sized people down here. All right, list 3 environmental conditions that amplify the effects of water erosion: steep slopes, intense rain, and sparse vegetation cover. Explain the impact soil erosion has had on farmlands worldwide. It has had a huge impact. Basically, as our population grows, because of poor land management practices, the amount of land where we can grow crops has been shrinking, even though industrial agriculture has increased the amount of food we can get per acre. At some point that tops out, and then as we remove soil that you can grow crops on through poor soil management, you're basically making it so you have less and less land to grow food on. See page 242 through 243 for some specific examples to kind of tuck away in your memory. Yeah, this slide is a little early. I'll come back to it. The Fertile Crescent. Explain how soil erosion has impacted the lands once known as the Fertile Crescent. What are the countries within that region like today? Through human action, which you're going to read about in your cartoon guide, this greatly reduced fertility in the area. It's now largely desert. The picture on the left-hand side shows you where the Fertile Crescent used to be. That used to all be rich farmland. Now you can see on the right-hand side, especially during the dry season when it doesn't rain, there is next to no land that is available for crop growth. Let's see, what else? Explain what qualities of arid and semi-arid lands makes them susceptible to desertification. Identify countries and regions susceptible to desertification. The word arid means dry and almost desert-like conditions to start with. So they have very small yearly precipitation levels that cannot keep up with the growing human population and their needs. The land already has little vegetation, so when man comes in and uses especially poor farming practices, you end up turning the almost desert into the desert, which you can see here. And we're going to talk about exactly what's going on here in terms of trying to keep the Sahara from growing. The sand right here is part of the Sahara and its surrounding deserts. Grows at a couple feet per year, and what they're trying to do here is replant trees. There did used to be a forest there to keep the desert from continuing to grow. How is soil degradation a positive feedback loop? Poor soil quality means few plants grow. Limited plant cover means more soil erosion. More soil erosion means less nutritious soil is available, meaning even fewer plants can grow, yada, yada, yada. All right, going back to this slide that's out of order. Explain how desertification in China is linked to air pollution in North America. Dust storms that originate in China due to poor land management practices blow across the Pacific Ocean and into the airspace over North America. These dust storms, which you can see, are incredibly dramatic and can last most of a day, providing conditions that you would only see in the middle of the night. These travel at 70 feet per minute. These are analogous to what we saw here during the Dust Bowl, which we're going to talk about here in a second. All right, measuring soil erosion. In the science behind the stories, describe three methods currently used to quantitatively measure soil erosion. So that means through quantities, through the presence or absence of something that you can measure. The first one is erosion pins, spikes driven into the ground that are measured as they are uncovered by erosion. So that would be here on the upper left-hand corner. Catch pits, that's the lower left-hand corner here. They collect eroded soil, usually brought to the pit via water, where it's then measured. And then nuclear fallout is something that you can use. You measure amounts of radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 in soil over time to track its movement. There's a PDF here that explains some of these, or you could just look in your book under the section Science Behind the Stories in this particular section. All right, know about the Dust Bowl, location, time period, what else was happening during the time in history, the environmental and human influences that caused it, what it looked like, its effects, etc. For this particular quiz, just know the very basics. We are going to watch a little bit of a video in class about this. It happened in the U.S. in the southern Great Plains that include, I'll get back to that in a second, that include New Mexico, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and Kansas. This was in the early 1930s. This was also the time of the Great Depression. So, the Dust Bowl basically was a result of poor land management. All of a sudden, because of high winds that had always existed there, topsoil blew away, leaving behind deserts. So you already have the Great Depression. You have farmers who can no longer farm because their land is now crap. And you saw a huge migration of people out of those states looking for work during a time when there was no work. This was the consequences of overfarming that occurred between the years 1879 to 1929. I'm not going to expect for you to know those, but just 20, 30 years. Actually, let's see. In the 50 years before the 1930s, when the Great Depression was upon us, nobody thought about conserving soil. And we ended up with this, and it happened to converge along the time that the stock market crashed. So this created deserts and windy areas. So subsoil blew everywhere, as you can see here. You can imagine that windows were not airtight, and you ended up with situations like this: grit in everything, cars covered up in the space of an evening or two, houses completely filled with and covered by the subsoil just blowing everywhere. It was like the end of the world in these particular areas. Again, here's the Dust Bowl. On a national exam, I would expect that you could pick out a state that didn't belong in a list. Also, on a free response question, it's always a good idea to remember one or two of these states. All right, so what, again, a result of the Dust Bowl is no crops could be grown there, there's no biodiversity, there's air and water pollution, so on and so forth. What laws and agencies came out of the Dust Bowl disaster? What did they do? The Soil Conservation Act of 1935 came out of this, as did the Soil Conservation Service. These things basically required that you treat your land better. The specific list of duties are on page 246, but just realize that this is when things like better ways of growing crops and teaching farmers how land management skills came out of the consequences of the Dust Bowl. All right. Describe the following soil conservation methods: crop rotation, contour farming, terracing, intercropping, or also called strip cropping, shelter belts, which is also known as a windbreak, alley cropping, and no-till farming. Be able to cite specific benefits of each, explain how to do each method, recognize a picture of each method, ID any possible cons, and suggest appropriate methods for a given terrain. This is found in page 247 to 249 of your textbook. I really recommend that you take a look at that. You can see that you also are going to need to know about hydroponics, which will be in the supplemental material. No-till farming and polyculture we've already talked about. Polyculture was in Chapter 9, Part 1, and no-till farming was a part of the case study that we talked about earlier in this particular video. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and go through these. Crop rotation is where you grow something different in different places on your farm every year. You can see, here's an example of that. Typically, one parcel is left fallow. A fallow plot is where you don't grow any crops that are meant for a market. And you either just leave it alone, or even better, you grow a cover crop on it. And you especially, the farmers especially would tend towards a bean crop, which are legumes, or alfalfa or clover, because those plants shelter nitrogen fixing bacteria. So at the end of that particular growing season, when you plowed the cover crop back into the soil, you would find that there was more nitrogen in there. You're basically replenishing the nitrogen levels which plants need to grow in that particular part of your land with little to no effort on your part. So the upside is this is a way of reducing the amount of pesticides you use, because insects come back to the same place year after year after year and get completely confused by the fact that what they wanted to eat is no longer there, and then they move on. They don't exactly go looking through the entire farm. This is also kind of a low effort way of keeping up the nutrition and the fertility of your soil. The downside is that it cuts into your profits for that year, because there's one plot of land you're purposely not growing anything on. And it's good for any terrain. You can do this anywhere, really. All right, here's another example of crop rotation. All right, contour farming is where you go around hills and you kind of follow the curvature of the land rather than insisting on straight rows. This is good because it discourages water-borne erosion, because instead of running down these straight rows, you're having the water run with the curvature of the land, and you're giving the plants more time to go ahead and absorb water before it can rush topsoil away. The downside is sometimes it can make harvesting difficult because there aren't straight lines. However, when you talk about farms that are 600, 800, 1,000 acres and you do this kind of contour farming, it's not that big of a deal, because it just requires you to kind of turn your tractor a little bit to the side as opposed to driving in a straight line. So it's basically getting over the idea that your crop growth needs to be in these neat and orderly rows. Terracing is where you farm in stair steps up a mountain rather than just plowing directly up the mountain. You can see that stairs have been formed into this mountain instead of just trying to plow straight up and down the mountain, or even straight across. This is very beneficial because you're giving plants more time to absorb water when it rains, meaning that you have less soil erosion. Now the downside is that it can be difficult to cut these terraces into the mountain, but once they're built, they're built. Alley cropping is exactly what it sounds like. You grow your crops in these alleys in places that is really windy, that's really windy, and then you grow either tall bushes or even trees that are perpendicular to the way that the wind blows. So here, wind may be a problem blowing from left to right across your picture. Well, when you grow these trees, you reduce the wind's effect on your crops. Also, if you happen to grow things like pecan trees or apple trees or some sort of crop-bearing tree, you are then increasing your profits, or even for firewood. Now, the downside is they are going to cast shade on your crops at certain times of the day, so they have to be able to handle that. Also, let's see what else. It can also reduce the spread of disease and insects, because again, if you get hit with an insect that likes a certain crop, they'll only go as far as the trees and they'll stop. Let's see what else I have written down for this. It can also be beneficial to diversify the types of crops grown in one area, because each crop takes up differing amounts of nutrients. The downside is it can make harvesting and fertilizing and pest management difficult if you're used to a monoculture. And again, the trees cast shade. And the difference between alley cropping and shelter belts is that shelter belts are basically around the entire thing, whereas alley cropping is just along two sides. So shelter belts are useful when you've got winds coming in from all different directions. And again, the same pros and cons apply to that. All right, no-till cropping we already talked about. That's where crop residues are left on the ground and seeds are drilled into the soil rather than plowing first and putting the seeds in the furrows. It greatly reduces soil erosion and leaves decomposing sources of nutrients on the ground, but that can mean more weeds initially until the crops establish themselves. Soil can also become overly compacted unless you grow plants that are really, really good at creating more air pockets in your soil so that the roots can grow, or you just have worms in there that helps as well. Different types of soil conservation here. Here on the left, you can see that this is contour plowing. This could also be called intercropping because you have different types of crops growing in different strips of the land. The benefit to that is that it reduces, again, the spread of pests and disease, but it can make harvesting difficult if you're not used to harvesting things at different times of the year. You can also be smart in how you grow this stuff because it could be that one crop is a natural pesticide for the other crop. Right here on the right hand side, you can see that this is terracing up a steep mountain. Upper left hand corner, this is alleys cropping, and then here upper right hand corner, these are shelter belts, also called windbreaks. Here in the middle bottom of this slide, that is intercropping or strip cropping, and you also look at the curvature. You could also argue that this is contour farming. All right, what is green manure? It is the use of vegetation clippings as a soil enhancement. It's like leaving grass clippings on the lawn after mowing. What are cover crops? They are crops planted that will never be harvested. They will instead be plowed into the ground as green manure when mature, but before seeds form so that you don't have them growing up as weeds. By the way, weeds is a positional word. Something, as an example, grass growing in your lawn is a good thing, but if grass sends a runner into your ornamental plants along your borders, then it becomes a weed. Why are legumes often used as cover crops? Because again, they harbor the bacteria that fix nitrogen into the ground. And then why use green manure in cover crops? Because it both enriches the soil and it prevents soil erosion. All right, and then what general principle guides all erosion control methods? Maximize vegetative cover at all times to protect the soil, both from erosion and also from loss of nutrition. And that ends this particular video.